Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus.
"Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?"
He said to him,
"What is written in the law? What do you read there?"
He answered,
"You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself."
And he said to him,
"You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live."
But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus.
"And who is my neighbor?"
Jesus replied,
A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spent." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?
He said,
"The one who showed him mercy."
Jesus said to him,
Go and do likewise. The word of the Lord. Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The Good Samaritan is one of the most well-known parables that Jesus has ever told. Parables, those short stories that Jesus told to his hearers in order to illustrate his message to the people. Everyone at some point in their life, I'm sure, has heard of the Good Samaritan. Even a lot of people that don't attend church regularly have heard of this story. The story of the Good Samaritan has even been a part of many of our local state laws. The law is called the Good Samaritan Law, which basically says, if I, in good faith, do whatever I need to help save your life, you can't sue me. The problem with the story, though, that is so well known is that we tend to think we already know all there is to know about the story. The most common interpretation of the Good Samaritan is the story is all about helping others who are in need. Well, that is partially true, but is there something else to this story that possibly we missed, something that we maybe have overlooked? From my own experiences, I found that we miss things when we don't consider the historical context in which the story takes place. The historical context really informs the meaning of the story. The story of the Good Samaritan is told by Jesus in response to a conversation that he is having with a lawyer. Not like a modern-day lawyer. This would have been somebody who was an expert in the Jewish law, those first 5 books of the Torah or Hebrew Bible. The lawyer asked Jesus a question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? From the very beginning of their conversation, the lawyer's question seems very individualistic, and he seems very optimistic that he is capable of obtaining what is needed for eternal life himself. Jesus points him to the Jewish law, which as a lawyer, I'm sure that he was more than familiar with. The lawyer responds by naming the two most central commandments of the Jewish faith. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. The first commandment is part of the Jewish Shema that every Jewish person would have known since their childhood. And they would have been expected to recite this prayer twice every day. Love the Lord your God. The centrality of this prayer for Judaism is very similar to the centrality that we have for the Lord's Prayer. We recite it every Sunday, and every other day we have special occasions. But it's the second commandment that is central to this story, and that is loving your neighbor as yourself. This is the commandment that prompts the lawyer to ask Jesus the question, who is my neighbor? It is in response to this question that Jesus shares this now famous parable, the Good Samaritan, with the lawyer and with all those who are around him listening to the story. When I think about neighbors and being neighborly, I can't help but think about the television show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as a child, but it wasn't until later on in life, as an adult, that I began to understand what all of the messages were in each of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I recently watched on Netflix a documentary about Mr. Rogers that goes into detail about this, and it's very fascinating. I recommend it highly. The messages of every episode were meant to speak to the historical as well as the social context of their own time and place in which they were filmed in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I would like to share with you one of those episodes. In episode 1065 that aired on May 9th, 1969, Mr. Rogers invites Officer Clemens, who is a black police officer on the show, to his backyard to cool off his feet in a little kiddie pool. They both take their shoes and socks off and dip their feet into the pool. Mr. Rogers takes the green hose and sprays it on both of their feet. When they are done, Mr. Rogers dries off Officer Clemens' feet and then uses the same towel to dry off his own feet. If you didn't know the historical context of this episode, you would have simply thought that what Mr. Rogers was doing was simply an act of neighborly kindness. However, there is more going on in this episode than simple neighborly kindness. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed into law that ended the practice of segregation. However, despite this law, public swimming pools all over the country were still excluding black people from swimming in pools with white people. In 1964, a group of black and white people in protest splashed into a pool at a motel in St. Augustine, Florida, that was still enforcing segregation. This angered the motel manager to the point in which he decided to pour acid into the pool. Fortunately, the acid was diluted in the pool water and no one was injured. When the lawyer asks the question, who is my neighbor? He is really asking him, who is not my neighbor? He is trying to narrow the field down to make it more manageable and easy for himself. Surely this command is not talking about everybody, you would have thought. The ancient world was a tribal world where everybody had their own tribes for physical locations. So everyone that he would have lived around would have been from the same tribe. Probably would have thought and acted the same way. So he's probably thinking, well, this is pretty easy if we're just thinking about neighbors as the person who lives next door, because we're all in the same tribe, right? None of us are any different. When Jesus tells this story, we call the Good Samaritan, it is no accident that the hero of this story is a Samaritan. This would have been challenging, I'm sure, for the lawyer, because Jews and Samaritans have been bitter enemies over a long period of time. Our text from a couple of Sundays ago illustrates this point. In Luke chapter 9, when Jesus has messengers go into a Samaritan village to see if there is a place for him to stay for the night, the Samaritans refuse him. And then his disciples say, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Jesus, of course, rebukes them, and they travel on. I can't help but think that in the next two chapters, when we have this story, that Jesus still has that incident in the back of his mind when he tells the story to be a challenge for his listeners. The hatred between the Jewish people and the Samaritans begins when Israel is divided into two different kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. In 721 BC, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom, took control of it, and sent many of the Jewish people into exiles as captives. However, there were some Jewish people that stayed in the northern kingdom and intermarried with the Assyrians and other Gentiles. Gentiles were those non-Jewish pagan tribes. In 586 BC, the Babylonians invaded the southern kingdom, took control of it, and led those in the southern kingdom off to exile. The temple was destroyed, and the city walls were torn down. The word Samaritan is first mentioned in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. When the Persian Empire had taken over the Babylonian Empire, and Nehemiah had gotten the new Persian king to let them to go back into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. That's when we first hear the term Samaritan. The Samaritans that were there opposed the rebuilding of the temple. So there's the first conflict. Samaritans believed that the worship of God was to take place in Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem. And they only accepted the first 5 books of the Torah or the Old Testament. They did not accept any of the other Old Testament books. Those returning to Jerusalem saw the Samaritans as traitors for intermarrying with Gentile pagans and referred to them as half-breeds. They believed that the Samaritans had defiled their religion, the religion of their Jewish ancestors. They really hated one another. No Jewish person in Jesus' day would have ever referred to a Samaritan as good. It would have been an oxymoron. When Jesus ends the parable, he asks the lawyer which one of these 3 acted like a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers. The lawyer, if you notice in the text, cannot bring himself to name the person as being a Samaritan. All he can say is the one who showed him mercy. There's a subtle shift that Jesus makes when he tells the story. He does not directly answer the lawyer's question. Did you notice that? He never says to the lawyer, yes, these people over here are your neighbors, and those people over there are not. He simply tells him this story, and then asks the lawyer, well, who was the neighbor to the man in the ditch? His concern moves from, he shifts the conversation from, who is your neighbor, to how can you be a good neighbor? This story leads me to conclude that a neighbor is anyone who goes out of their way to help one who is in need. I don't think this is simply about being a nice person. Yes, that's true, but there's something more here. I think it's directly related to how we see the nature of God and the nature of all of God's creation. I think that Martin Luther King Jr. makes this connection well in the last sermon he would ever preach before he was assassinated. When he preached on this very text, he concluded by saying, the priest and the Levite asked themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? The Samaritan reverses the question by asking himself, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? We are all interconnected as children of God. What happens to one has a direct impact upon all of us. The senseless violence that occurred at a Highland Park 4th of July parade was an event that affected all of us. Even if we didn't personally know the victims or survivors, we were all one people sharing the same hurt, same humanity. When one of us hurts, we all hurt. We are all created in God's image. We are all God's children. There are no narrow categories where some are God's children and some are not. We are neighbors to all who are in need. The story of the Good Samaritan invites us all to imagine how we would respond to the man in the ditch. And who are we in this story? Maybe there's been times in your life when you have been the man in the ditch who has relied upon a Good Samaritan to help you out of the ditch. You may not be proud of it, but maybe there has been times in your own life where you have been like the priest or the Levite. You have simply passed by the man in the ditch. Or maybe you've taken the risk of being like the Good Samaritan, who sacrifices a lot on behalf of another. Being a Good Samaritan is not something that we can do by ourselves, though. We cannot do this by ourselves through our own hard work and initiative. The only way that we can be Good Samaritans is because God has first shown us love, grace, and mercy in the person of Jesus Christ. It is the Christian church that collectively engages in this ongoing work of being the Good Samaritan. When we reflect back to others the love, grace, and mercy that we have received from God and Jesus Christ. And when we do this collectively as a church, we will be doing what the Good Samaritan did, which was finding our way to love.